Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing at the entrance to a great stone castle, dawn breaking over distant hills. The air is cold, biting at your face, and you can see your breath misting in front of you. You're wearing 60 pounds of steel plate armor, every piece carefully fitted to your body, and in your hand rests a sword that cost more than a peasant family might earn in 10 years. You are a knight, and everything you thought you knew about what that means is probably wrong. We've all seen the movies. The gleaming armor, the noble quests, the damsels in distress. Knights riding off into glorious battle, honor and glory their only concerns. But the reality of being a knight in medieval Europe was something altogether different. It was a life of brutal training, crushing financial pressure, religious devotion, political maneuvering, and yes, sometimes glory. But that glory came at a price most of us can't even imagine. Tonight, we're going to walk through what it actually meant to be a knight during the High Middle Ages, roughly from the 11th to the 15th centuries. We're going to start at the very beginning, when you were just a child, and follow the entire journey. We'll explore the years of training that transformed boys into warriors. We'll examine the feudal obligations that bound knights to their lords. We'll feel the weight of armor and learn why everything you've heard about it being too heavy to move in is completely false. We'll discover the code of chivalry and how it shaped behavior both on and off the battlefield. We'll experience the pageantry of tournaments and the brutal reality of actual warfare, and we'll understand both the economics and the eventual decline of this legendary warrior class. This is going to be a deep journey into a world that's simultaneously more complex and more fascinating than any Hollywood depiction. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back in time to discover what it was really like to be a knight in the medieval age. If you were going to become a knight, your path began not when you were a strong young man, but when you were barely out of diapers. The journey to knighthood was long, grueling, and started surprisingly early in childhood. Around the age of 7, if you were born into a noble family or showed particular promise, you would be sent away from your parents' home. And we're not talking about going to boarding school a few towns over. You'd be sent to serve in the household of another noble, often a friend or ally of your father, or sometimes a lord to whom your family owed allegiance. This wasn't abandonment, though it might have felt like it to a 7-year-old child. It was the first step on the long road to knighthood, and it was considered an honor for both the boy and his family. You would enter this new household as a page. The word itself comes from the Old French, meaning a young servant or attendant, and that's essentially what you were. Your days as a page weren't filled with sword fighting and battlefield tactics, at least not yet. Instead, you were learning the basic building blocks of noble life. Pages served at table during meals. They learned proper etiquette and manners, which in medieval noble society were incredibly important. You had to know how to address people of different ranks, how to conduct yourself in the presence of ladies, and how to eat properly at formal dinners. These might sound like minor things to us now, but in a society built on rigid hierarchies and social codes, they were absolutely essential. But it wasn't all social graces. Pages also received their first education in reading and writing, which was far from universal even among the nobility. You'd learn Latin, the language of the church and of educated men. You'd study religious texts, because a knight was expected to be a defender of Christendom. You'd learn music and poetry, because knights were expected to be cultured men, not just brutal warriors. And yes, you'd begin your physical training. Pages learned to ride horses, starting with smaller mounts and gradually working up to the powerful warhorses that knights would eventually ride into battle. You'd practice with wooden swords and miniature weapons, building strength and coordination. You'd learn the basics of weaponry, how to hold a sword, the proper stance, the fundamental movements. You'd also learn about armor by helping to care for your lord's equipment. You'd clean mail shirts by rolling them in barrels of sand and vinegar, which removed rust and kept the metal bright. You'd polish pieces of plate armor until they gleamed. You'd learn how each piece fit together, how it moved, how it protected. This hands-on experience was invaluable, because one day you'd be wearing this equipment yourself, and your life would depend on understanding it perfectly. The daily routine of a page was demanding. You'd wake before dawn, attend morning prayers, serve breakfast, then spend the day moving between lessons, physical training, and service to the household. Evenings might bring more formal dinners where you'd serve at table, followed by more prayers before bed. It was a life of discipline, structure, and constant learning. This phase of your training lasted about 7 years until you were around 14 years old. At that point, if you'd proven yourself capable, you'd advance to the next stage. You'd become a squire. Becoming a squire was a significant promotion. The word squire comes from the old French esquire, meaning shield bearer, and that captures a big part of what you'd be doing. As a squire, you were now directly attached to a specific knight, usually the lord of the household or one of his trusted knights. You became his personal attendant, his assistant, and his student all rolled into one. Your training intensified dramatically. The wooden swords were put away, replaced with real steel. You'd spend hours every day training with actual weapons, learning not just the basic movements, but the intricate techniques of swordsmanship. And this wasn't like modern fencing. Medieval sword fighting was about power, leverage, and the ability to deliver devastating blows while defending yourself effectively. You train with the lance, the primary weapon of mounted knights. Learning to couch a lance, to hold it steady under your arm while your horse galloped at full speed, to aim it accurately at a moving target, all while controlling your mount with your knees since both hands were occupied. This required incredible skill and coordination. You'd practice with maces, war hammers, and battle axes. Each weapon had its own techniques, its own advantages and disadvantages. A sword could cut and thrust, but might not penetrate heavy armor. A mace or war hammer could crush armor and break bones beneath without needing to penetrate. An axe concentrated tremendous force on a small cutting edge, making it lethally effective. Physical conditioning became even more intense. Many squires followed training regimens that would impress modern athletes. There are historical accounts of squires and young knights performing extraordinary feats. They'd run long distances in full armor to build endurance. They'd practice vaulting onto horses without using stirrups, a skill that was absolutely necessary if you were unhorsed in battle and needed to remount quickly. They'd wrestle, building the strength and grappling skills needed for close combat. They'd perform acrobatics and tumbling exercises to improve their agility and coordination. One of the most famous examples comes from a French knight named Jean Le Menge, better known as Boucicaut. His biography, written during his lifetime in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, describes his training routine in remarkable detail. Boucicaut would run and leap in full armor. He'd perform somersaults while armored. He'd climb walls and scale ladders wearing his full combat equipment. He'd vault onto a horse without touching the stirrups while wearing all his gear. He'd do handstands and walking exercises, again, all while encased in steel. This might sound insane, but it was done for very practical reasons. Battles could last for hours. If you couldn't maintain your strength and stamina while carrying 60 pounds of armor in the heat of summer, while fighting for your life, you were going to die. The training had to match or exceed the demands of actual combat. As a squire, you also accompanied your knight everywhere. When he went to war, you went with him. You'd help him arm before battle, which was not something a knight could do alone. Getting into full armor required assistance. You'd hand him each piece in the proper order. You'd fasten buckles and tie laces. You'd make sure everything fit correctly and that he could move freely. During battles, you'd be nearby, holding spare lances, extra weapons, supplies. If your knight's weapon broke, you'd quickly hand him a replacement. If he was injured, you'd help him retreat and tend to his wounds. After battle, you'd help him remove his armor, clean his equipment, and tend to his horse. You were also expected to learn leadership and administration. Knights weren't just warriors, they were landlords, managers of estates, local authorities. Squires would help manage their knight's household, keep accounts, oversee servants and peasants, and handle correspondence. These skills were just as important as martial prowess. This phase of service as a squire typically lasted another 6 or 7 years, from around age 14 to 20 or 21. By the end of this period, you'd spent your entire life, from age 7 to your early 20s, training for one purpose. Now, finally, you are ready. The ceremony of knighthood, called dubbing, was a profound ritual that combined military, social, and deeply religious elements. The ceremony could happen in various ways. Sometimes it took place in a church or chapel, with priests officiating and calling down God's blessing. Sometimes it happened on the battlefield, when a lord rewarded exceptional valor by immediately knighting a squire who had distinguished himself in combat. In the most formal version, you'd begin with a ritual bath, symbolizing purification. You'd spend the entire night before your dubbing in prayer, keeping a vigil in the chapel, your sword laid on the altar before you. This was called the Vigil of Arms, and it was meant to be a time of deep spiritual preparation. You were dedicating your sword, your strength, and your life to the service of God, your Lord, and the code of chivalry. In the morning, you'd be dressed in special garments, each with symbolic meaning: a white tunic for purity, a red cloak for the blood you might shed or the sacrifice you were prepared to make. A black coat is sometimes added, representing death and your willingness to face it. The actual dubbing itself was relatively simple. You'd kneel before the lord or king who was knighting you. He'd strike you on the shoulder with the flat of his sword, or sometimes simply with his hand, this blow called the accolade or coley. This was often the last blow you were expected to receive without retaliation, symbolizing your submission to your lord and to the principles of knighthood. Words would be spoken, the exact phrasing varied, but they'd emphasize your new responsibilities: to be brave, to defend the weak, to serve God and the church, to uphold justice, to be loyal to your lord, to fight with honor. You'd be given your knightly equipment: a sword blessed by a priest, spurs which marked you as a mounted warrior, sometimes a belt, a symbol of your new rank. You'd swear oaths, promising to uphold the code of chivalry, to be faithful to your lord, to defend Christendom against its enemies. And then it was done. You were no longer a squire, you were a knight. You'd achieved what you'd been training for since you were 7 years old. But in many ways, the hardest parts of your journey were just beginning. To understand what it meant to be a knight, you have to understand the entire system in which knights existed, the feudal system. And this is where things get complicated, because feudalism wasn't a system anyone intentionally designed. It evolved gradually over centuries as a practical response to the collapse of centralized authority after the fall of the Roman Empire. Imagine Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Carolingian Empire, which had briefly united much of Western Europe under Charlemagne, had fragmented into dozens of competing kingdoms and territories. Central governments were weak or non-existent. There was no standing army, no police force, no reliable system of justice. Viking raiders attacked from the north, Muslim invaders from the south, Magyar horsemen from the east. It was a world of constant violence and insecurity. In this environment, people needed protection, and protection came from men who could fight, specifically men who could afford horses, armor, and weapons. These mounted warriors, these knights, became the foundation of a new social order. The system worked through a series of personal relationships based on land ownership and military service. At the top was the king, who was, in theory, the owner of all land in his realm, but the king couldn't control or defend all that land himself. So he'd grant large portions of it to his most powerful nobles, men like dukes, counts, and barons. These grants of land were called fiefs. But this wasn't an outright gift. It came with strings attached. When a noble received a fief from the king, he became the king's vassal. In a formal ceremony called homage, the noble would kneel before the king, place his hands between the king's hands, and swear an oath of fealty. He'd promise to be faithful, to provide military service when called, to give counsel, to support the king. The king, in return, promised to protect his vassal, to support him in legal disputes, and to not strip away his lands without cause. This relationship of lord and vassal, of fief and service, repeated at every level of society. A great noble, like a duke, who held a large fief from the king, couldn't manage or defend all that land himself either. So he'd subdivide it, granting smaller fiefs to his own vassals, who might be counts or barons. They'd swear homage to the duke, just as the duke had sworn homage to the king. And these counts and barons would do the same, subdividing their lands further, granting smaller fiefs to their vassals. Down and down it went, creating a pyramid of relationships. At the bottom of this pyramid were the knights, holding the smallest fiefs, often just a single manor, enough land to support one mounted warrior. Everyone except the king at the top had a lord above them. Everyone except the peasants at the bottom had vassals below them. The whole system was based on these personal bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation. So what exactly did these obligations entail? What did you owe your lord as a knight? The primary obligation was military service. When your lord called, you had to come. You had to show up with your equipment, your weapons, your armor, your horse, ready to fight. This was called knight service, and it was the very foundation of the system. In most places, the obligation was typically 40 days of military service per year. That might not sound like much, but remember, you had to provide all your own equipment. You had to leave your lands and your family. If a campaign lasted longer than 40 days, and many did, you either had to stay on voluntarily or your lord had to pay you to continue serving. Those 40 days could be used in various ways. Sometimes it meant going to war, fighting in your lord's army in an actual military campaign against his enemies. Sometimes it meant garrison duty, spending your 40 days stationed in one of your lord's castles, maintaining security, standing guard. Sometimes it meant escort duty, accompanying your lord as he traveled, providing protection and displaying his power and status. Beyond the 40 days of standard service, there were other military obligations. If the king himself called for a general levy, a summoning of all the military forces in the kingdom, you were expected to respond regardless of whether you'd already served your 40 days to your immediate lord. These general levies usually happened only in times of serious crisis, foreign invasions, or major civil wars, but when they came, you had to go. You also owed your lord what was called castle guard. Many knights were required to spend additional time, beyond their 40 days of field service, manning their lord's castles, maintaining the fortifications, keeping watch, and training the garrison. But military service wasn't your only obligation. You owed your lord counsel. This meant attending his court, participating in discussions about legal matters, disputes between vassals, and questions of governance. Your lord couldn't make major decisions without consulting his vassals, and you were expected to give your honest advice and then support whatever decision was made. Then there were the feudal incidents, special payments owed to your lord on specific occasions. These were significant financial obligations that could be crippling if you weren't prepared. If your lord was captured in war, you had to contribute to his ransom. Being held for ransom was actually quite common in medieval warfare, and ransoms could be enormous. Every vassal was expected to contribute according to their means. When your lord's eldest son was knighted, you owed a special payment to help cover the expenses of the ceremony and the celebration that went with it. When your lord's eldest daughter married, you owed another payment to help provide her dowry. If your lord went on crusade, traveling to the Holy Land to fight for Christendom, you owed yet another payment to help fund the journey. And here's where things get even more complicated. If you died, your heir couldn't simply inherit your fief. He had to pay a relief, essentially an inheritance tax, to your lord before he could take possession of the land. If your heir was a minor, your lord became his guardian and managed the fief until the heir came of age, collecting all its revenues during that time. If you died without an heir, the fief reverted to your lord entirely, a process called escheat. If you wanted to sell your fief or any part of it, you needed your lord's permission. If you wanted to marry, particularly if you were marrying outside your lord's territory, you often needed permission. Your lord had significant control over your life and your property. These obligations ran both ways, though. Your lord had responsibilities to you as well. He owed you protection. If someone attacked you or your lands, your lord was obligated to defend you or support you in defending yourself. He owed you justice. If you had a dispute with another vassal, your lord's court would hear the case and render judgment. He owed you maintenance of the fief. He couldn't just strip away your lands on a whim. As long as you fulfilled your obligations, your fief was secure, and in most places by the 12th century, fiefs had become hereditary, passing from father to son. But here's the thing, this whole system worked only as long as everyone involved took their oaths seriously. These weren't just words. In the deeply religious society of medieval Europe, to break your oath was to endanger your immortal soul. When you swore fealty to your lord, you were calling God as your witness. To betray that oath, to fail in your obligations, was considered a mortal sin. Betraying your Lord was the most serious crime imaginable. It was called felony, and the word eventually came to mean any serious crime because betraying your feudal lord was seen as equivalent to betraying the entire social order, which itself was seen as ordained by God. So when you became a knight and swore your oaths to your lord, you weren't entering into a business arrangement that you could back out of if you got a better offer. You were binding yourself, body and soul, to another man. Your life was no longer entirely your own. Your lord called, you came. He needed your counsel, you gave it. He went to war, you fought beside him. That was the deal. And breaking it meant losing everything, your lands, your honor, your place in society, possibly even your soul. This was the framework in which knights lived their lives, not as free agents, not as independent warriors doing as they pleased. They were nodes in a vast web of obligations and relationships, each strand connecting them to lords above and vassals below, all of it held together by oaths, by honor, by the very real fear of both earthly punishment and divine judgment. Let's go back to the training, because we need to understand just how demanding the physical preparation for knighthood really was. We've touched on some of this, but it deserves a deeper look, because modern people, seeing knights in movies or looking at armor in museums, often have a completely wrong impression of what these warriors were capable of. There's a persistent myth that knights were slow, clumsy, unable to move well in their armor, that they needed cranes to mount their horses, that they'd be helpless if they fell down. All of this is complete nonsense, and we know it's nonsense because we have detailed descriptions of actual knight training, and because modern recreations using authentic armor have proven beyond any doubt that knights were not only mobile, but remarkably agile. Let's start with the basic physical conditioning. Knights needed to be extraordinarily fit. Medieval combat, whether in tournaments or actual warfare, was intensely physical. You weren't sprinting for 30 seconds and then getting a break. You might be fighting for hours at a time, swinging weapons, grappling with opponents, controlling a powerful horse, all while carrying the weight of your armor. Historical sources tell us that knights engaged in a range of conditioning exercises that would be familiar to any modern athlete. Running was fundamental. Knights would run long distances to build cardiovascular endurance. And they didn't just run in their normal clothes. They'd run in their armor, getting used to moving and breathing with that weight on their bodies. The account of Jean Boucicaut that we mentioned earlier is incredibly detailed about his training. Boucicaut would run and march long distances in full armor. The biography states that wearing his armor didn't slow him down or make him clumsy. On the contrary, he'd practiced so extensively that the armor moved with him like a second skin. He'd perform leaping exercises, jumping over obstacles, over horses, over barriers, all while fully armored. This wasn't showing off, though there was certainly an element of display. This was practical training. On the battlefield, terrain was rarely smooth and open. You needed to be able to move across rough ground, to leap over ditches, to scramble over obstacles, and armor couldn't slow you down. Boucicaut would climb walls using his hands and arms, pulling his entire body weight plus the weight of his armor upward. He'd climb rope ladders and scaling ladders, the kind used in sieges, again, fully armored. This built incredible upper body and core strength. He'd vault onto his horse's back without using the stirrups, without any assistance, launching himself from the ground to the saddle, and not just once as a party trick. He'd practice this over and over until he could do it smoothly every time, even in the chaos and exhaustion of battle. He'd practice somersaults and tumbling exercises while armored, developing the kind of body awareness and coordination that would allow him to recover quickly if he was knocked down, to roll with impacts, to move fluidly despite the armor. And this wasn't unique to Boucicaut. Other sources mention similar training. A German manuscript from the 15th century shows illustrations of knights training. In one image, you see knights wrestling with each other while Federschwitz, training swords, lie at their feet. In another, knights are lifting and throwing stones to build strength. In another, they're fighting with staff, building weapon handling skills, and learning to judge distance and timing. A Norwegian text from the 13th century, called the King's Mirror, which was written as advice to a young prince, specifically recommends extensive physical training for anyone who wants to excel in arms. It emphasizes that success in warfare isn't just about equipment or even courage. It's about conditioning and skill that only comes from constant practice. The key insight here is that medieval warriors understood something fundamental. Natural strength wasn't enough. Even the strongest man, if he wasn't specifically trained and conditioned, would be at a disadvantage against someone who was. And they understood that training had to be specific. You had to train in the conditions you'd fight in, which meant training in armor, training with real weapons, training in ways that simulated actual combat as closely as possible without excessive danger. Weapon training was daily and extensive. Swords weren't huge, clumsy clubs. A typical medieval sword weighed about 3 pounds, maybe 3.5 at the most. That's only slightly heavier than a modern baseball bat. The weight was balanced precisely, with the center of balance close to the hilt, making the sword responsive and quick. But using a sword effectively required tremendous skill. You weren't just hacking wildly. You had to understand leverage, angles of attack, how to strike with maximum force while maintaining your defense, how to bind your opponent's blade and control it, how to transition smoothly from cuts to thrusts, how to fight equally well from horseback or on foot. Knights would practice against wooden posts, called pels, striking them thousands of times to build muscle memory and strength. They'd practice against each other with blunted weapons. They'd study under masters of arms who passed down techniques that had been refined over generations. The lance required its own specialized training. A lance wasn't a spear you threw or thrust with while holding it in your hand. It was a long, heavy wooden shaft, often 10 to 12 feet long, with a sharp metal point. You'd couch it under your arm, holding it steady, and then charge at full gallop. The momentum of your horse combined with your body weight would drive that point forward with devastating force. Learning to couch a lance properly, to hold it steady without it wavering or bouncing, to aim it accurately while your horse is thundering across uneven ground, to strike precisely at a small, moving target, all of this required countless hours of practice. You'd start by riding at posts, trying to strike them with the lance point. Then you'd practice against other riders. The timing had to be perfect. Start your charge too soon and your horse would tire before impact. Too late and you wouldn't build enough momentum. And you had to control your horse with your knees and weight shifts because your hands were occupied with the lance and your shield. Wrestling and grappling were also crucial parts of training. Medieval combat often ended up very close and personal. If your lance broke on the first charge, if your sword was knocked from your hand, you needed to be able to wrestle, to throw your opponent, to use your dagger effectively at close range. Knights trained extensively in wrestling techniques, in maintaining balance, in breaking holds, in using leverage to overcome opponents who might be larger or stronger. There was also training in horsemanship that went far beyond simply being able to ride. Knights needed to control their horses in the chaos of battle, amid noise, violence, and the smell of blood. Warhorses were specially trained to be aggressive, to bite and kick enemies, to charge forward even when every instinct told them to flee. Controlling such an animal required skill and constant practice. Knights would practice rapid mounting and dismounting, sometimes while wearing full armor. They'd practice controlling their horses while also managing their weapons. They'd practice formation riding, moving as a unit with other knights, maintaining line, and keeping proper spacing. Dancing was sometimes mentioned as part of knight training, which might sound strange, but it makes sense when you think about it. Dancing developed footwork, balance, rhythm, and coordination, all of which transferred directly to combat. Some accounts specifically mention knights dancing in armor or on shields to improve their balance and agility. And all of this training was ongoing. It didn't stop once you were knighted. Knights who wanted to stay alive, who wanted to excel, continued training throughout their lives. Times of peace didn't mean vacation. They meant an opportunity to train even more intensively. The famous knight and chronicler Geoffrey de Charny, writing in the 14th century, emphasized that a knight should constantly seek to improve. He should watch and learn from better knights. He should practice his skills daily. He should never become complacent. Charny explicitly says that simply being strong or brave isn't enough. Without skill, without training, strength is wasted, and bravery is just a quick path to death. This dedication to training helps explain why knights were so effective on the battlefield. They weren't just men in armor. They were highly trained professionals who had spent literally their entire lives preparing for combat. When a knight charged into battle, behind that charge was 20 years or more of daily practice, of conditioning, of skill development. That's what made them so formidable. Not the armor or the horses or the weapons, though those helped. It was the training, the relentless, exhausting, never-ending training. Now let's talk about the armor itself, because this is where we need to debunk some of the most persistent myths about medieval knights. We've all seen the cartoons or movies where knights are depicted as barely able to move, clanking around like tin cans, needing assistance just to stand up. The reality was dramatically different. Medieval armor evolved significantly over the centuries we're discussing. In the early period, around the 11th and 12th centuries, knights primarily wore mail armor, what's often inaccurately called chain mail. The correct term is just mail, and it was made from thousands of small steel or iron rings, each ring linked to 4 others, creating a flexible mesh. The main piece of mail armor was the hauberk, a long shirt that could extend down to the knees. A full mail hauberk weighed roughly 20 to 25 pounds. That's not nothing, but it's not crushing. Modern firefighters carry 35 to 40 pounds of equipment when they enter burning buildings, and soldiers throughout history have carried comparable or greater weights. The weight of mail was distributed across your entire upper body, hanging from your shoulders. But there was a technique that made it more manageable. If you put your arms up over your head, had someone buckle a belt very tightly around your waist, and then lowered your arms, much of the weight would transfer from your shoulders to the belt around your hips. This distributed the load more evenly and made it more comfortable to wear for extended periods. Mail had significant advantages. It was flexible, allowing full range of motion. You could run, jump, climb, and fight without being restricted. It provided excellent protection against slashing attacks. A sword swung at mail wouldn't cut through, the rings would catch and stop the blade. Mail was also relatively affordable to produce compared to later armor types, though it was still expensive and labor-intensive, with each hauberk requiring thousands of individual rings to be made and linked. But mail had weaknesses. While it stopped cuts, it didn't do much against crushing blows. A mace or warhammer striking mail could break bones beneath without penetrating the armor itself, and a strong thrust from a lance or a narrow-pointed sword could sometimes pierce through, pushing rings apart or breaking them. By the 13th and 14th centuries, knights began adding pieces of plate armor over their mail. These started small, just covering vital areas like the chest and knees, but gradually expanded. By the 15th century, full plate armor, what we typically picture when we think of a knight in shining armor, had developed. A complete suit of plate armor for battle, called a harness, typically weighed between 45 and 60 pounds. Again, this wasn't an unbearable weight. It was actually less than what a modern soldier carries in full combat gear. A US soldier in Afghanistan might carry 70 pounds or more of body armor, ammunition, water, and equipment. The crucial difference is distribution. Plate armor was custom-fitted to the wearer's body. Each piece was articulated, meaning it moved with you. The weight was distributed across your entire frame. Your legs bore the weight of the leg armor, your arms bore the weight of the arm armor, your torso bore the weight of the cuirass. Nothing was hanging entirely from your shoulders like a backpack. And the articulation was sophisticated. The joints at the shoulders, elbows, knees, and waist were designed to allow natural movement. Skilled armorers understood anatomy and biomechanics. They knew where the body bent, where it needed flexibility, where it could handle rigid protection. Modern tests using authentic reproductions of 15th century armor have demonstrated that wearers can run, jump, climb ladders, do somersaults, and get up from the ground without assistance. There's a wonderful video experiment where a group of researchers had volunteers wear accurate reproductions of full plate armor and then measured their exertion levels during various activities. Yes, wearing armor increased energy expenditure compared to not wearing armor, but the increase was modest, only about half again as much energy as moving unarmored. that's comparable to carrying a moderately heavy backpack. The volunteers could jog, climb stairs, and perform combat movements without undue difficulty. The only activity that was notably harder was getting up from lying flat on the ground, which took about twice as much energy. But even that was manageable with proper technique, and every knight would have practiced the proper technique thousands of times. The myth about needing a crane to mount a horse is particularly absurd. It originated from a misunderstanding. In tournaments, there were sometimes elaborate displays where knights were lowered onto their horses as part of the ceremony and pageantry. This wasn't because they couldn't mount themselves. It was theater, showmanship. In actual practice, knights mounted their horses the same way Boucicaut did, by vaulting up, or by using a mounting block, or simply by putting a foot in the stirrup and swinging the other leg over. The armor didn't prevent any of this. Let's walk through a complete suit of plate armor piece by piece, because understanding what each piece did helps explain how the whole system worked together. You'd start with an arming doublet, a padded cloth jacket worn under the armor. This had laces and attachment points where pieces of plate would be tied. It also provided cushioning, absorbing impacts, and preventing the armor from chafing your skin. On your legs, you'd wear mail shoes, basically mail stockings, or sometimes just mail leggings covering the vulnerable areas. Over these would go plate leg armor. Sabatons covered your feet, articulated plates that allowed your feet to flex. Greaves protect your shins. Polans covered your knees, often with side wings that protected the vulnerable sides of the joint. Cuisses covered your thighs. Your lower body armor was carefully designed to allow you to sit comfortably on a horse while still providing maximum protection. The plates overlapped, sliding over each other as you moved, expanding and contracting as needed. For your torso, you'd wear a cuirass, which consisted of a breastplate covering your chest and a backplate covering your back. These were shaped to deflect blows, with curves and ridges that would cause weapons to glance off rather than striking squares. A fold, a skirt of articulated plates, hung from the bottom of the cuirass, protecting your lower abdomen and upper thighs while allowing you to bend and sit. Your arms were protected by rerebrace covering the upper arm, counters covering the elbows, vambraces covering the forearms, and gauntlets covering your hands and wrists. The gauntlets were particularly sophisticated, with articulated fingers that allowed you to grip your weapons while still being protected by steel. Your shoulders were covered by pauldrons, large curved plates that protected this vulnerable area while allowing your arms full range of motion. These were among the most complex pieces to design because the shoulder joint moves in so many different directions. Finally, your head was protected by a helmet. Early knights wore simple conical helmets with a nose guard. Later came the Great Helm, a bucket-like helmet that completely enclosed the head. By the 15th century, the bassinet with visor was common, offering good protection while allowing better visibility and breathing through a hinged faceplate that could be raised when not in immediate danger. Helmets were hot and claustrophobic. There's no getting around that. The padding inside was necessary to prevent concussions from blows, but it made ventilation difficult. Knights would often ride without their helmets on, only lowering the visor or putting on the helmet right before combat. This wasn't recklessness. It was necessary because wearing a helmet for hours at a time, especially in warm weather, would exhaust you before the battle even began. The entire suit, when worn properly, felt surprisingly natural to someone who'd trained in it from childhood. Yes, you were aware of the weight. Yes, it was warm. But it didn't feel like you were trapped in a metal prison. It felt like protection, like a shell that moved with you. Of course, armor this sophisticated was extremely expensive. A full harness of plate armor could cost as much as a small estate. In modern terms, we're talking about the equivalent of a luxury car or more. Many knights couldn't afford a complete suit and would make do with partial plate over mail, protecting their most vital areas with steel and leaving less vulnerable spots covered only by mail or even thick padded cloth called a gambeson. The armor had to be maintained constantly. It would rust if not cared for properly. After any use, it needed to be cleaned, dried, and oiled. Leather straps and laces wore out and needed replacing. Plates could be dented in combat, and would need to be hammered back into shape. A well-maintained suit could last for decades and might be passed down from father to son, but that required constant care. Your weapons were equally important and equally expensive. The sword is what everyone thinks of, and it was indeed a key weapon, but it wasn't always the primary one. Swords were sidearms, backup weapons, and symbols of status as much as combat tools. A good sword was a work of art and engineering. The blade had to be flexible enough not to shatter on impact, but hard enough to hold an edge. This required sophisticated metalworking, folding and tempering the steel, techniques that had been refined over centuries. The best swords came from certain regions known for their quality, places like Toledo in Spain or Solingen in Germany, and they commanded premium prices. Your primary weapon on horseback was the lance. A proper war lance was a serious piece of equipment. The shaft was made from ash or another strong, somewhat flexible wood. It needed to be strong enough to not shatter on impact, but had to have some give to absorb shock. The tip was a sharp steel point designed to penetrate armor. The lance had a hand guard to protect your hand on impact, and sometimes a vamplate, a circular guard that protected your forearm. Lances were consumable. They broke regularly in combat and tournaments. A knight going to war would bring multiple lances or know that he'd need to acquire more after the first charge. For close combat, many knights preferred maces or war hammers. These were devastatingly effective against armor. A mace was essentially a steel head on a wooden shaft, designed to deliver maximum crushing force to a small area. The weight of the head, the length of the shaft providing leverage, your arm strength, and the momentum of your swing all combined to create an impact that could crush helmets, break bones, and leave opponents stunned or dead, even if their armor wasn't penetrated. Warhammers had a similar principle, but with a different head design. One side might have a hammer face for crushing, the other a spike for penetrating. Some warhammers had a long spike on top, turning them into armor-piercing picks. These could punch through even quality plate armor if you struck hard enough and at the right angle. Battle axes were also popular. A knight's battle axe wasn't the enormous two-handed weapon you might imagine. It was often a one-handed weapon that could be used from horseback or on foot. The axe concentrated force on a narrow cutting edge, making it capable of shearing through mail and even damaging plate armor. For very close quarters combat, every knight carried a dagger. This wasn't for throwing or general fighting. It was a specialist tool for armored combat. Called a rondel dagger or a misericord, it had a narrow, stiff blade designed for one purpose, thrusting through gaps in armor. If you'd wrestled an opponent to the ground, if you'd gotten inside his guard, you'd use the dagger to find a gap at the armpit, the groin, the visor of the helmet, anywhere the armor didn't cover, and thrust home. You also needed a shield, though shield use declined as plate armor improved. Early knights used large kite shields that covered most of their body. Later, smaller heater shields became common. By the time of full plate armor, some knights dispensed with shields entirely, using two-handed weapons instead, or simply relying on their armor for protection. Your horse was as important as any piece of equipment, and in some ways more so. The destrier, the great warhorse of the medieval knight, was bred specifically for combat. These weren't the largest horses, they weren't draft horses. They were powerful, quick, and aggressive. A good destrier could cost as much as or more than a suit of armor. Warhorses were trained from birth to tolerate the chaos of battle, to charge forward on command, to bite and kick enemies. They were intelligent, responsive animals, and the bond between a knight and his destrier could be profound. Losing your warhorse in battle was a disaster, not just tactically, but emotionally and financially. Horses could also wear armor. Barding, as horse armor was called, could include a chamfron protecting the head, a coronet for the neck, a petrel for the chest, and flanchets for the flanks. Full barding was rare because of the expense and because it could exhaust a horse in hot weather, but partial barding was common, especially for the head and chest. You'd actually need multiple horses. Your destrier was too valuable to ride on ordinary travel. You'd have a palfrey, a riding horse, for normal movement. You'd have a pack horse to carry your equipment. Squires and servants would have their own horses. A knight traveling to war might have a small string of 5 or 6 horses with him. The total cost of being a knight, when you add up the armor, the weapons, the horses, the feed for the horses, the servants needed to care for everything was substantial. This is why knights needed fiefs, needed those grants of land. The income from the fief, from the peasants working the land and paying rents and fees, was what funded the equipment and lifestyle necessary to function as a knight. Being a knight wasn't just expensive in terms of equipment, it was expensive in terms of time and energy. You couldn't farm your own land, not seriously. You couldn't engage in trade or crafts. Your job was to train for war, to fight when called, to maintain your equipment, to fulfill your obligations to your lord. You needed the income from your fief to support you so you could focus on being a warrior. This economic reality shaped everything about knightly life. It's why the feudal system developed as it did. It's why knights were so protective of their lands and their rights. It's why inheritance was so crucial, why the loss of a fief was catastrophic. Without land, without income, you couldn't afford to be a knight. You couldn't maintain the equipment, the horses, the retinue. You'd be a knight in name only, unable to fulfill your function. Now we need to talk about the ideals that were supposed to guide a knight's behavior. The famous code of chivalry. But we need to be careful here, because there's the ideal and then there's the reality, and they often have very little to do with each other. The word chivalry comes from the French word for horse, cheval, and originally it simply meant cavalry, horsemen, knights. But over time, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, it came to mean something more, a code of behavior, an ideal of how a knight should act. This code wasn't written down in one place. It wasn't official or standardized. Different regions and different periods emphasized different aspects, but certain themes appear consistently across sources like songs, poems, advice literature, and chronicles. A knight was supposed to be brave. Cowardice was the ultimate shame. You were expected to face danger without flinching, to protect those weaker than yourself, to never retreat unless ordered by your lord. This wasn't just macho posturing. In a world where warfare was constant and protection depended on men willing to fight, bravery was an essential virtue. A knight was supposed to be loyal to his lord, faithful to his oaths. We've already discussed how the feudal system depended on these bonds, but chivalric literature elevated this into a moral principle. Betraying your lord wasn't just breaking a contract. It was a moral failure, a stain on your honor that could never be fully washed away. A knight was supposed to be skilled in arms. Prowess, the ability to fight effectively, was celebrated endlessly in chivalric literature. Knights who performed great deeds in battle were remembered and praised. Knights who failed were mocked. This emphasis on prowess encouraged the endless training we discussed earlier. A knight was supposed to be courteous, to display good manners, to be generous, to show respect to other nobles. This might seem superficial, but in a society where personal relationships and reputation were everything, courtesy was important. A knight who was crude, rude, or mean-spirited would find himself isolated, unable to make alliances, unable to function effectively in noble society. A knight was supposed to be a defender of the weak, particularly widows, orphans, and the church. This is where chivalry starts to blend into propaganda, because while some knights genuinely tried to live up to this ideal, many others were perfectly happy to oppress and exploit the weak when it served their purposes. But the ideal was there, constantly repeated in literature and sermons, and it did influence behavior to some degree. A knight was supposed to be pious, a devout Christian who attended Mass, respected the clergy, supported the church. Knights weren't monks, but they were expected to be religious. The church worked hard to Christianize the warrior culture, to channel violence in directions the church approved of, like crusades against Muslims or heretics, rather than wars between Christian lords. The church had actually developed a concept of the three orders of society: those who prayed, the clergy; those who worked, the peasants; and those who fought, the knights. Each had their role in God's plan. The knight's role was to protect the other two orders, to use their capacity for violence in service of a righteous cause. This is where we get the blessing of swords and the religious elements of the dubbing ceremony. The church was trying to sacralize warfare, to make knighthood not just a social class, but a religious vocation, at least when knights were fighting in approved causes. And then there was courtly love, which added another layer to the chivalric ideal. Courtly love emerged in the 12th century, particularly in southern France, and it was a strange, sophisticated game of romantic devotion. The basic idea was that a knight would choose a lady, usually of higher social rank than himself, often the wife of his lord, and he would devote himself to her. He would perform great deeds in her honor. He would write poetry for her. He would display her colors in tournaments. He would suffer nobly from unrequited love, because the love was supposed to remain chaste, unconsummated. This might sound bizarre to modern ears, and yes, it was absolutely a literary convention, a game played by bored aristocrats, but it had real social effects. It elevated women, at least noble women, to a position of honor and respect that they hadn't held before. It encouraged knights to moderate their behavior, to be more refined, more cultured. A knight who wanted to win a lady's favor had to be more than just a skilled fighter. He had to be educated, eloquent, capable of appreciating poetry and music. The literature of courtly love filled the courts. Songs and poems celebrated knights performing incredible deeds to win their lady's favor. The most famous examples come from the Arthurian romances, stories of knights like Lancelot, who was utterly devoted to Queen Guinevere, or tales of knights seeking the Holy Grail as the ultimate expression of both martial prowess and spiritual purity. But here's where we need to inject a heavy dose of reality. These were ideals. Real knights often fell far short of them. Yes, knights were expected to be brave, but plenty of knights ran from battle when things looked bad. Yes, they were supposed to be loyal, but knights betrayed their lords regularly when offered better terms by rivals. Yes, they were supposed to protect the weak, but in practice, knights were often the ones oppressing peasants, burning villages, stealing crops, and generally making life miserable for the people they were theoretically protecting. Medieval warfare was brutal and often deliberately targeted civilians. Knights participated in chevauchées, raids specifically designed to terrorize the population, burning crops, destroying villages, and driving off livestock. The goal was to damage your enemy's economy and break the morale of his people. This was standard military practice, and it was done by knights who then went to church and heard sermons about protecting the innocent. The gap between ideal and reality was significant. Chivalric literature was aspirational. It described how knights should behave, not necessarily how they did behave. But the constant repetition of these ideals in songs, stories, sermons, and advice literature did have an effect. It created social pressure. A knight who flagrantly violated chivalric norms would be criticized, mocked, potentially ostracized. And some knights genuinely tried to live up to the ideals. Figures like the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, son of Edward III of England, were celebrated for their chivalric behavior. William Marshall, who served several English kings in the 12th and 13th centuries, was held up as the perfect example of a knight who embodied all the chivalric virtues. These men were famous precisely because they came closer to the ideal than most. The Code of Chivalry also created rules for warfare, at least among knights. Knights weren't supposed to kill other knights if they could avoid it. Taking prisoners and ransoming them was preferable. This wasn't just humanitarian sentiment. A dead knight couldn't pay a ransom, but a captured knight could be worth a fortune. In battle, knights would often focus on capturing other knights rather than killing them. They'd aim to unhorse them, to disarm them, to force surrender. Common soldiers had no such protection. They were killed without mercy. But knights extended a degree of professional courtesy to each other, recognizing that they were all part of the same warrior class and that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. This created strange situations where battles could be incredibly brutal, with thousands of common soldiers dying, while the knights on both sides would end the day relatively unscathed, captured but treated well, fed, and housed comfortably until their ransoms arrived. Of course, this could break down. In some battles, particularly when passions were high or when one side was bent on total victory, knights would kill each other without mercy. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is infamous for the English killing French prisoners, violating the codes of chivalry, but they did it because they feared the prisoners would rearm and rejoin the fight. Chivalry was also culturally specific. It was primarily a Western European concept. Knights fighting Muslim opponents in the Crusades often found that the rules they expected to govern warfare didn't apply. Muslim warriors had their own codes of honor, their own expectations, and these didn't always align with Christian chivalric ideals. This led to misunderstandings, atrocities on both sides, and a gradual realization that chivalry wasn't a universal code, but a cultural construct. Even within Europe, chivalric standards varied by region and period. German knights might have different expectations than French knights. English chivalry developed its own characteristics, and as we move from the High Middle Ages into the Late Middle Ages, into the 14th and 15th centuries, chivalry became increasingly formalized and ritualized, more about ceremony and display than about actual behavior. The founding of chivalric orders is a good example. Orders like the Order of the Garter in England or the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy were elite organizations of knights who swore special oaths and wore special insignia. These orders reinforced chivalric ideals through their rules and rituals, but they also became exclusive clubs, marks of status and favor more than guarantees of virtuous behavior. So when we talk about the code of chivalry, we need to hold two ideas simultaneously. First, it was a real ideal that influenced how knights saw themselves and how society judged them. Second, it was often honored more in the breach than in the observance, a pretty fiction that masked a reality that was much more violent, selfish, and morally ambiguous than the songs and stories suggested. Knights were products of their culture, and medieval culture was deeply hierarchical, intensely violent, and comfortable with contradictions that would trouble us today. A knight could genuinely believe he was serving God while burning a village full of innocent people. He could believe in courtly love while routinely rapping peasant women. He could praise chivalry while betraying his lord for a better offer. The human capacity for compartmentalization and self-deception is remarkable, and medieval knights were as human as anyone else. For all the emphasis on warfare and combat, most knights spent most of their time not fighting. Wars were seasonal, often lasting only a few months. Even during wartime, there were long stretches of preparation, movement and waiting, and there were extended periods of peace when no wars were happening at all. So what did knights actually do with their time when they weren't campaigning? The answer is that being a knight was actually a full-time job even in peacetime. You had a fief to manage, responsibilities to fulfill, a position to maintain, and the daily routine of a knight reflected all of these demands. Let's walk through a typical day for a knight during peacetime, understanding that this would vary significantly based on your wealth, your specific situation, and the season. You'd wake at dawn or before. Medieval people didn't sleep through the night the way we do. They'd typically have a first sleep from shortly after dark until around midnight, then wake for an hour or two, then have a second sleep until dawn. During that wakeful period in the middle of the night, they might pray, tend to bodily needs, have sex, or just lie quietly. Monks used this time for additional prayers and meditation. Upon waking, the first obligation was prayer. Knights were expected to be pious. You'd pray privately, or if you were in a castle with a chapel, you might attend morning mass. The church divided the day into canonical hours, times for prayer, and devout knights tried to observe at least some of these. After prayers came breakfast, though this might be just a light meal, bread and ale, something to break the night's fast, but not too heavy since you'd have work to do. Then you turn to the business of running your estate. If you held a fief, even a small one, you were essentially a landlord and a local authority. Peasants would come to you with disputes, with questions, with problems. You'd have to settle these, acting as judge and administrator. You might need to tour your lands, checking on the work being done. Were the fields being plowed properly? Were the crops healthy? Was the harvest being brought in on time? Medieval agriculture was the economic foundation of everything, and a knight needed to understand it and monitor it, or he'd find himself unable to support his household. There would be accounts to review. Your steward or bailiff would report on income and expenses, rents collected, fees paid, goods sold, supplies purchased. You couldn't delegate this entirely. You needed to know the state of your finances, or you'd be at the mercy of dishonest servants who might embezzle or deceive you. If you were a vassal of some importance, you might need to attend your lord's court. This wasn't a daily obligation, but regularly you'd be expected to present yourself, to give counsel, to participate in the governance of your lord's territory. This could mean traveling to your lord's castle and spending days or weeks there. Around midday came dinner, the main meal of the day. For a wealthy knight, this could be an elaborate affair with multiple courses. Meat was a sign of status. Nobles ate meat regularly, while peasants ate it rarely. You might have beef, pork, mutton, chicken, game birds, venison if you'd been hunting. There would be bread, vegetables, and fruits in season. Wine for the wealthy, ale for everyone. Dinner wasn't just about eating. It was a social occasion, a time to conduct business, to cement relationships, to display your wealth and status. If you had guests, and wealthy knights often did, the quality and abundance of your table reflected on your honor. Afternoons might be spent on training and exercise. Even in peacetime, you need to maintain your skills and fitness. You might practice with weapons, either alone or with your squires and other knights if you were in a large household. You might go riding, keeping yourself and your horse in condition. Wrestling matches and other physical contests were popular both for exercise and entertainment. Hunting was a major activity for knights, and it served multiple purposes. It provided food for your table. It was excellent training for warfare, requiring horsemanship, weapon skills, tracking, and quick decision-making. And it was a social activity, a way to bond with other nobles, to display your wealth through your equipment and your hounds, to demonstrate your skill and bravery. Medieval nobles didn't hunt alone with a bow from a tree stand. They hunted in large groups with packs of trained dogs. Hunting deer meant mounted pursuits across the country, chasing the stag for hours until it was exhausted, then killing it with spears or swords. Hunting boar, which were common and dangerous, required nerve. These animals could kill a man or a horse with their tusks. Falconry was equally popular among the nobility. You'd carry a trained hawk or falcon on your gloved hand, release it to pursue game birds, and watch it make the kill. Different birds were appropriate for different ranks. The goshawk for a knight, the peregrine for an earl, a gerfalcon for a king. Falconry required patience and skill to train the birds and knowledge to hunt successfully. Both hunting and falconry were such important parts of noble life that there were extensive treatises written about them. Books on hunting techniques, on training dogs and birds, on the proper protocols. These weren't just hobbies, they were cultural markers, things that separated nobles from commoners. Late afternoon might bring more administrative work, correspondence to deal with. If you were literate, and by the later medieval period most knights were at least functionally literate, you'd write letters yourself. If not, you'd have a clerk or priest who could write for you. Communication with your lord, with other knights, with relatives, all of this required regular correspondence. Evening brought supper, a lighter meal than dinner. Then there might be entertainment. Minstrels might perform if you were wealthy enough to have them in your household, or if traveling entertainers were passing through. Stories would be told, songs sung. Knights were expected to appreciate and participate in cultural activities. Many knights wrote poetry themselves, or at least memorized poems and songs to recite. You might play games. Chess was popular among the nobility and was seen as good training for strategic thinking. Dice games and board games provided gambling opportunities. Cards came later, but became popular once they were introduced. If you were at a larger castle or court, there might be dancing. This was part of courtly culture, and knights were expected to know how to dance appropriately at formal occasions. Throughout all of this, religious observances continued. Evening prayers before bed, observance of feast days and fasts. The church's calendar structured the year, and devout knights observed it carefully. Certain times of year brought specific activities. Spring meant overseeing planting. Summer might mean military campaigns if there was a war. Late summer and fall meant harvest, which was crucial. If the harvest failed, everyone suffered. Winter was a time of relative inactivity, waiting for spring, maintaining equipment, training indoors. The church calendar brought its own rhythm. Lent meant fasting and prayer. Easter was a major celebration. Christmas was another important feast, often marked by gatherings of lords and vassals. Saints' days throughout the year brought special observances. If you were married, which most knights were once they established themselves, family life added another dimension. You'd have children who needed to be raised and educated. Sons would begin their own training for knighthood, often being sent away as pages just as you had been. Daughters needed to be educated in the skills appropriate for noble women, managing households, supervising servants, and the cultural accomplishments that would make them attractive marriage prospects. Marriage among the nobility was usually arranged, a matter of political alliance and economic benefit more than romantic love. But that doesn't mean marriages were loveless. Many couples developed genuine affection over time, and the partnership was real. Husband and wife had to work together to manage their household and lands. Noble women had significant responsibilities. When their husbands were away at war, which could be for months or years at a time, women managed everything. They oversaw the estate, dealt with legal matters, sometimes even organized the defense of their castles if they came under attack. Women weren't trained in combat, but they were trained in management and leadership, and they exercised real power in their husband's absence. The daily life of a knight, then, was full and demanding even in peacetime. You weren't just lounging around waiting for the next war. You were managing an estate, fulfilling social and religious obligations, maintaining your skills, and participating in governance. It was a privileged life compared to the peasants who worked your land, but it wasn't idle or easy. And threading through everything was the constant awareness that you might be called to war at any time. Your lord might summon you. The king might call for a general levy. A neighboring lord might attack. You needed to be ready financially, with your equipment maintained and your body fit. You needed to be ready mentally and emotionally for the demands of combat. That awareness shaped everything about how you lived. When we imagine medieval knights, many of us picture tournaments, the colorful pageantry, the clash of lances, the crowds cheering. And tournaments were indeed a huge part of knightly culture, but they were much more complex and much more dangerous than most people realize. Tournaments emerged in the 11th century as a form of military training. In times of peace, knights needed to practice their skills, particularly the crucial skill of mounted cavalry combat. Individual practice was fine for technique, but it didn't prepare you for the chaos, the fear, the split-second decisions of real battle. Tournaments provided that experience without the full risk of actual war. The early tournaments, called melees, were massive, chaotic mock battles that bore little resemblance to the structured jousts we usually imagine. A melee might involve dozens or even hundreds of knights divided into two sides. They'd fight across miles of countryside, through forests and fields, sometimes even through villages. The goal was to capture enemy knights and hold them for ransom, just like in real war. These events were incredibly violent. Knights used real weapons, not blunted ones. The only difference from actual warfare was that you were supposed to capture rather than kill your opponents, but accidents happened constantly. Knights died in melees, sometimes in significant numbers. They were trampled by horses, struck down by weapons, crushed in the chaos of hundreds of armed men colliding. The church repeatedly tried to ban tournaments. Popes issued bulls forbidding Christians from participating. The reasoning was partly religious. These were seen as occasions for sin, for pride and violence. But it was also practical. Kings didn't want their knights killing each other or exhausting their resources in mock battles when real wars might be imminent. But the bans never stuck. Tournaments were too popular, too ingrained in knightly culture. They offered glory, prizes, and most importantly, a chance to demonstrate your skill and gain reputation. A knight who performed well in tournaments would be known throughout the region. Lords would seek him out for their retinues. Marriage prospects would improve. Opportunities for advancement would multiply. William Marshall, one of the most famous knights of the Middle Ages, made his early fortune entirely from tournaments. He was born a younger son with no inheritance, no lands, nothing but his training and his skill. He began competing in tournaments and became so successful at capturing other knights and collecting their ransoms that he became wealthy. Later in life, his biographer calculated that he'd captured more than 500 knights in tournament combat. That statistic tells you two things. First, Marshall was extraordinarily skilled. Second, tournaments happened constantly and involved huge numbers of participants. This was a major industry. By the 13th century, tournaments began to evolve. The melee remained popular, but new, more structured forms emerged. The joust, a one-on-one mounted combat, became increasingly central. In a joust, two knights would charge at each other on horseback, each carrying a lance, each trying to strike the other. The goal was to unhorse your opponent, or at minimum to break your lance against his shield or armor. Points were awarded for successful strikes, with hitting different targets worth different scores. Breaking your lance earned points. Striking your opponent's helmet earned more. Unhorsing him was the ultimate success. The joust required incredible skill. You had to control your horse, keeping it running straight down the tilt, which was a barrier erected between the two charging knights to prevent head-on collisions. You had to couch your lance properly, holding it steady as your horse galloped. You had to aim at a moving target while you yourself were moving. And you had to do all of this while wearing armor, with your vision restricted by your helmet. The impact when two knights collided was tremendous. Lances were designed to shatter on impact, absorbing some of the force, but even so, the shock of collision was severe. Knights were regularly knocked unconscious. Broken bones were common. Backs and necks could be injured from the violent impact. Death, while less common in jousts than in melees, still happened. Lances could splinter in unpredictable ways, with wooden shards punching through the slits in visors or finding gaps in armor. Despite the dangers, or perhaps because of them, jousting became immensely popular as a spectator sport. Tournaments evolved into elaborate social events, lasting for days, attended by huge crowds. They became opportunities for political display, for diplomatic meetings, for arranged marriages to be negotiated. The pageantry was extraordinary. Knights would arrive with their retinues, their colors and heraldry displayed prominently. Heraldry, the system of symbols and designs on shields and surcoats, had originally developed as a practical necessity. You needed to be able to identify who was who on the battlefield when everyone was covered head to toe in armor. But by the tournament era, heraldry had become an art form and a complex system of family pride and status. Each knight had his coat of arms, a unique combination of colors, patterns, and symbols that identified him and his lineage. Heralds, specialists in heraldry, would announce the participants, describing their arms and their ancestry. This was important because your heraldry told everyone who you were, who your family was, what your claims to status and honor were. Pavilions would be erected around the tournament grounds, colorful tents where knights could rest, have their equipment maintained, and receive medical attention if injured. Ladies would sit in viewing stands, often with their own heraldry displayed, and knights would compete to win their favor. A knight might wear a lady's token, a scarf or ribbon, tied to his arm or helmet. Prizes were awarded to the winners. These could be valuable, expensive armor, fine horses, and significant amounts of money. But more valuable than any physical prize was the glory, the reputation. A knight who performed well at a major tournament would be talked about for years. Songs might be written about his deeds. His fame would spread. The tournament also served as a marriage market. Young knights could display themselves to potential fathers-in-law. Noble fathers looking to marry off daughters would attend to evaluate potential sons-in-law. Alliances were formed, negotiations conducted, contracts signed, all in the social spaces around the tournament. Different types of tournament combat emerged. The pas d'armes was a variation where knights would hold a bridge or crossroads and challenge all comers to fight them. This could last for days or weeks, with the defending knights fighting multiple opponents each day. It was a test of endurance as well as skill. The melee evolved too, becoming more structured and safer. By the 14th and 15th centuries, melees were often fought in enclosed lists, defined boundaries, and increasingly with blunted weapons. The goal was still to capture opponents, but the risk of death decreased significantly. There were foot combats too, where knights fought on foot with various weapons. These might be fought over barriers to prevent grappling, or in open space where wrestling and dagger work came into play. The weapons used could vary by agreement. Sometimes swords, sometimes poleaxes, sometimes specialized tournament weapons designed to look dangerous while being relatively safe. The emphasis on safety increased over time, not because knights became less brave, but because the economics changed. Dead or crippled knights couldn't serve in real wars. As kingdoms began to rely more on their military forces, kings became less tolerant of knights killing each other in tournaments. Specialized tournament armor was developed. This was heavier and more protective than war armor, with reinforced pieces on the left side where you'd take impacts from lances. Helmets designed specifically for jousting had minimal eye slits and were firmly attached to the breastplate so they couldn't be knocked off or twisted around. Despite the increasing safety measures, tournaments remained dangerous. In 1559, King Henry II of France died from a jousting injury when a splintered lance penetrated the visor of his helmet and entered his brain. He lingered for days before dying, and his death effectively ended the era of royal participation in jousts, though tournaments continued among the nobility. The tournament was also a place where rules of chivalry were on full display and enforced. Knights who fought dishonorably, who struck after an opponent had yielded, who used illegal weapons or techniques, would be publicly shamed. They might be stripped of their heraldry, have their shields hung upside down, or be physically expelled from the tournament grounds. There were even specialized courts of honor, presided over by senior knights and heralds, who would judge disputes and accusations of unchivalric behavior. These judgments carried serious weight because reputation was everything in knightly society. For young knights just establishing themselves, tournaments were crucial opportunities. You could demonstrate your skill, make connections with powerful lords, potentially win prizes that would help fund your career. Many knights traveled from tournament to tournament, essentially becoming professional competitors. This created a circuit of sorts, with major tournaments at different locations throughout the year. Knights would travel with their retinues, forming friendships and rivalries with other knights they'd meet repeatedly at different events. It was a small world, and the tournament circuit was at its center. The expenses were significant. You needed your equipment maintained and repaired constantly. You needed horses, and tournament horses took brutal punishment and needed to be replaced regularly. You needed your retinue, squires, and servants to help you. You need to pay entry fees at many tournaments. You needed to maintain a certain level of display because appearing poor or shabby reflected badly on you. But for successful knights, the rewards could be substantial. Beyond the prize money and ransom payments, there were intangible benefits. Lords looking to recruit skilled knights for their retinues would scout tournaments. Reputation gained at tournaments translated into better positions, better fiefs, better marriage prospects. The tournament also served military purposes beyond just training. It allowed lords to evaluate the skill of their knights and the knights in rival territories. Intelligence could be gathered. You could see who had new equipment, new techniques, new tactics. The social aspects, the feasting and mingling that happened around the actual combat, provided opportunities for diplomacy and negotiation. By the late Middle Ages, tournaments had become almost more about display than combat. The actual fighting was brief, but the ceremonies, the processions, the banquets, the dancing could last for days. They were major cultural events, combining sport, art, politics, and social ritual into elaborate spectacles that consumed enormous resources but reinforced the entire structure of chivalric society. All the training, all the equipment, all the tournaments, they were preparing for this. Real warfare. And if you think tournaments were dangerous, they were nothing compared to the reality of medieval battle. Let's be clear from the start. Medieval warfare was not the organized, rule-bound affair that chivalric literature suggested. It was chaotic, terrifying, and brutal. And while knights were the elite forces, the glamorous cavalry that everyone wrote songs about, they were just one component of much larger armies that included infantry, archers, crossbowmen, and support troops. The basic tactical unit of medieval warfare was the cavalry charge. This was what knights trained for their entire lives. A mass of armored horsemen, lances couched, charging at full speed into enemy formations. The psychological and physical impact was devastating when it worked. Imagine seeing it from the receiving end. You're a foot soldier standing in a formation with your fellows. You can hear them before you see them, the thunder of hundreds of hooves, the ground shaking. Then they appear, a wall of steel and horseflesh bearing down on you at 30 miles per hour. The horses are huge, aggressive, trained to bite and kick. The riders are encased in armor, lances pointed at you, and their screaming war cries. The instinct to run is almost overwhelming. If the infantry broke and ran, the cavalry would slaughter them. A man running with his back turned was easy to cut down. The cavalry would pursue, lances thrusting, swords chopping down, horses trampling the fallen. A successful cavalry charge against broken infantry could result in near-total destruction of the enemy force. But if the infantry held their ground, if they maintained their formation, the cavalry charge became much more dangerous for the knights. Infantry armed with long pikes or spears, standing shoulder to shoulder, could present a hedge of steel points that horses would not willingly charge into. A horse, no matter how well trained, will not run full speed into a solid barrier if it can see that barrier. This is where the skill and bravery of knights was truly tested. You had to drive your horse forward, through its instinctive reluctance, into that wall of spears. And the spears were long, 12 to 15 feet, longer than your lance. They'd strike your horse before you could strike them with your lance. If your horse went down, you were in serious trouble. Even if you weren't injured in the fall, you were now on foot in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by enemies, probably with a broken lance, and having to draw your sword. Your armor protected you, but you were vulnerable. Infantry would swarm you, trying to wrestle you down, looking for gaps in your armor to thrust knives through. This is why knights fought in formations, not as individual warriors. A cavalry charge was most effective when delivered by a line of knights, riding knee to knee, presenting a solid front. The formation multiplied the impact. One knight could be stopped. 50 knights hitting simultaneously could shatter an infantry line. The command structure mattered enormously. Knights charged when ordered, not when they individually felt like it. Discipline was crucial. A premature charge, a charge delivered piecemeal instead of as a unified mass, would be ineffective and potentially disastrous. Once the initial charge was delivered, once lances had shattered or been dropped, the fighting became more fluid. Knights would draw swords, maces, or axes and continue fighting from horseback, swinging down at infantry, engaging other cavalry, trying to drive the enemy back through sheer ferocity and staying power. Medieval battles often had multiple phases. The initial cavalry charge, then a grinding melee in the center. Then possibly a second charge by reserves, then pursuit if one side broke. The whole thing could last for hours. And remember, you're doing all of this in armor, in whatever weather conditions exist, possibly having not eaten properly, certainly running on adrenaline and fear. The role of infantry grew over time. In the early medieval period, armies were primarily cavalry. The infantry were of relatively minor importance. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, infantry armed with pikes and other poloms became increasingly effective at stopping cavalry charges. The Battle of Courtrai in 1302, where Flemish infantry utterly destroyed French cavalry, was a wake-up call. Infantry could win. Archers and crossbowmen added another dimension. English longbowmen became famous for their ability to deliver massed volleys of arrows that could disrupt and damage cavalry formations before they even made contact. The battles of Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415 saw English archers decimate French cavalry with devastating effectiveness. Crossbows were powerful but slower to reload than longbows. However, they required less training. A crossbowman could be trained in weeks, whereas becoming a skilled longbowman took years. Crossbow bolts could penetrate armor at close range, making them deadly weapons against knights. The Church actually tried to ban the crossbow in 1139 at the Second Lateran Council, declaring it too lethal for use against Christians, though it could still be used against Muslims and heretics. The ban was ignored almost immediately, but it shows how threatening new weapons technology was seen to be. Siege warfare was different from open battle, but consumed far more time. Most medieval warfare actually consisted of sieges, capturing castles and fortified towns rather than meeting in open battle. Knights participated in sieges, but their role was less central. Sieges were won by patience, engineering, and logistics more than by individual martial prowess. A siege might last weeks or months. The attacking force would surround the castle or town, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. They'd build siege engines, massive catapults called trebuchets that could hurl huge stones at walls, or mangonels and ballistas for different purposes. They'd construct siege towers, mobile wooden towers that could be pushed up against walls to allow troops to fight at wall height. They'd dig mines, tunneling under walls to collapse them. Defenders would shoot back with arrows and crossbow bolts. They'd pour boiling water or hot oil on attackers trying to scale walls. They'd drop rocks. They'd repair breaches at night. They'd conduct sorties, sudden attacks out of the gates to destroy siege equipment or drive off attackers. For knights besieging a castle, the work was dangerous but often boring. Long stretches of camp life, maintaining the siege lines, interspersed with sudden moments of action and danger. Disease was often a bigger killer than combat in sieges. Armies camping in one place for months would face sanitation problems, contaminated water, infections spreading through the camp. Being besieged was psychologically difficult. You were trapped, your food supplies slowly depleting, knowing that if supplies ran out you'd have to surrender or starve. But castles were designed to withstand sieges. With adequate supplies and a determined garrison, a small force could hold out against a much larger army for months. The real goal of much medieval warfare wasn't actually to fight battles or conduct sieges, it was economic destruction. Chevauchés, those destructive raids we mentioned earlier, were standard practice. An army would march through enemy territory, burning crops, destroying mills and villages, driving off livestock, forcing peasants to flee to fortified locations. This served multiple purposes. It damaged the enemy's economy, reducing his ability to field armies. It demonstrated that he couldn't protect his people, damaging his prestige and encouraging vassals to switch allegiance. And it enriched the attacking army through plunder. Knights participated enthusiastically in chevauchés. There was loot to be gained, and nobles often turned a blind eye to the devastation because it served strategic purposes. But this was one of the places where the gap between chivalric ideals and reality was widest. Knights who supposedly existed to protect the weak were actively engaged in terrorizing and destroying the lives of peasants and townspeople. The physical demands of battle cannot be overstated. Modern recreations using period armor and weapons have shown that fighting for even 10 or 15 minutes in full armor is exhausting. Your heart rate spikes, you're breathing hard, sweat pours off you, the armor becomes stifling, and medieval battles could last for hours. Heat exhaustion was a serious problem. Knights fighting in summer could literally cook inside their armor. There are accounts of knights dying not from wounds, but from overheating. The padding under your armor becomes soaked with sweat. You become disoriented, weak, unable to fight effectively. This is why water was so important, and why squires and servants would be standing by with water for knights to drink between engagements. The psychological stress was equally intense. The noise of battle was overwhelming. Thousands of men screaming, metal clashing on metal, horses screaming when wounded, the wounded and dying crying out. The smell was worse. Blood, excrement, people voiding their bowels from fear or death. Horses disemboweled, their intestines spilling out. The stench of a battlefield was horrific and got worse as the day went on. And you were in genuine danger of dying or being horribly maimed. Swords could sever limbs. Maces could crush skulls. Arrows could penetrate vitals. You'd see friends killed beside you. You'd see horrific injuries, men with half their faces caved in, men with limbs hanging by threads, men screaming as they bled out. The psychological aftermath of medieval battles isn't discussed much in historical sources, but it must have been significant. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder certainly existed in medieval times, even if they had no name for it. Knights who'd been through multiple battles, who'd killed men in close combat, who'd seen terrible things, they must have carried psychological scars. Capture was always a possibility. As we've discussed, knights tried to capture each other for ransom rather than kill. If you were captured, your treatment depended on your value. High-ranking knights would be treated well, housed comfortably, allowed servants and relative freedom while negotiations for ransom occurred. Lower-ranking knights might be treated more harshly, but still better than common soldiers who might be killed or enslaved. But being captured was financially devastating even if you were treated well. Your family would have to raise the ransom money, potentially impoverishing themselves to buy your freedom. And until that ransom was paid, you were stuck, unable to fight, unable to manage your lands, unable to fulfill your obligations to your lord. Some knights spent years in captivity. King Richard I of England, though not just a knight but a king, was held captive for over a year, and his ransom nearly bankrupted England. Lesser knights might be held for similar or even longer periods if their families couldn't raise the money quickly. The reality of medieval warfare, then, was nothing like the romanticized versions in stories and songs. It was dirty, chaotic, terrifying work. Yes, there were moments of glory, spectacular charges, personal triumphs in combat, but they were rare moments in long stretches of hardship, danger, and horror. Knights who survived multiple campaigns did so through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer endurance, and many didn't survive at all. We've touched on the expenses of being a knight throughout this discussion, but let's pull it all together and really understand the economics. Because being a knight wasn't just expensive, it was crushingly, catastrophically expensive if you didn't have adequate income. Let's start with the armor. A full suit of quality plate armor in the 15th century might cost somewhere between £30 and £100 sterling, depending on quality and how much customization was involved. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn £5 or £6 per year. A knight's fief might generate £10 to £30 per year in income, depending on its size and quality. So your armor alone might cost anywhere from 2 to 10 years of a typical knight's income. And that's if you bought it all at once, which most knights couldn't afford to do. They'd acquire it piece by piece over years, starting with the essential pieces and adding more as they could afford it. And armor wasn't a one-time purchase. It needed maintenance and repairs. Pieces would be damaged in combat or tournaments and would need to be repaired or replaced. A major defeat where you lost your armor entirely could be financially ruinous. Your weapons added to the cost. A good sword might cost £1 or more. Lances were relatively cheap but needed constant replacement. Maces, axes, daggers, all of these added up. And like armor, weapons needed maintenance and occasional replacement. Your horse was potentially the single most expensive item you owned. A good warhorse, a destrier, could easily cost £50 to £100. That's more than your armor. And horses die in battle, from disease, from injury. A knight might go through multiple warhorses in a career. Even the other horses you needed, riding horses and pack horses, cost significant amounts. Feeding and stabling horses wasn't cheap either. A warhorse ate a lot, and it needed quality feed to maintain its strength and condition. You needed pasture or stables. You needed grooms to care for the horses. You needed equipment, saddles, bridles, horseshoes, and all of this cost money. Then there was your retinue. You couldn't function as a knight alone. You needed at minimum a squire to help with your armor and equipment. You probably needed additional servants, grooms for your horses, possibly men-at-arms if you were wealthy enough. All of these people needed to be paid, fed, and housed. If you were campaigning, you had to pay for all of this on the road. Food for yourself and your retinue, lodging if you weren't camping, replacement equipment and supplies. The costs mounted quickly. Tournament expenses were substantial. Entry fees at major tournaments, travel costs to get there, the risk of losing your armor or horse if you were defeated and captured, the need to maintain a certain level of display and pageantry. Knights who made their living from tournaments, like William Marshall, had to win consistently or they'd go broke quickly. Beyond equipment and direct expenses, there were the feudal incidents we discussed earlier. Payments when your lord's son was knighted, when his daughter married, contributions to his ransom if he was captured, the relief payment when you inherited your fief. These could come at any time and could be substantial. You also had to support the church. Tithes, payments to support your local church and clergy, donations that were socially expected, potentially funding the construction or repair of churches. Pious knights might give generously, and being known as generous enhances your reputation. Then there was the obligation of hospitality. Noble households were expected to be generous, to feed travelers, to host visitors. You needed to maintain a household impressive enough to reflect your status. Skimping too much on hospitality or display would mark you as poor or stingy, damaging your reputation. So where did the money come from? Primarily from your fief. The income from land, from rents paid by peasants, from fees and fines you could collect as a local lord, from a share of harvest yields. This is why land was so crucial. Without a fief, without that steady income, you simply couldn't afford to be a knight. The size and quality of your fief determines your standard of living and your military capability. A rich fief might generate enough income to support not just yourself, but additional men-at-arms, allowing you to bring a small retinue when called to war. A poor fief might barely support you and your squire. Knights could also earn money through service. If you were skilled and well-regarded, lords might pay you a wage to be part of their permanent household retinue. This was called being a household knight, and it could be lucrative, especially if you served a wealthy lord. You'd receive pay, often room and board, and possibly gifts and grants of land on top of your wages. Tournament winnings and ransoms could provide significant income. We've mentioned William Marshall making his fortune this way. Capturing an enemy knight in battle or tournament and ransoming him back could bring in substantial sums. But this was an unpredictable income and depended on your skill and luck. War could be profitable through plunder, sacking cities, capturing and ransoming enemies, seizing goods and valuables. Many knights went on crusades partly for religious reasons, but also hoping to gain wealth through plunder and land grants in conquered territories. The Fourth Crusade's conquest of Constantinople in 1204 made many knights enormously wealthy through looting one of the richest cities in the world. But for every knight who got rich from war, many more were impoverished by it. Campaign expenses, loss of horses and equipment, capture and ransom, time away from managing your lands, all of these could be financially devastating. Some knights engaged in what was essentially organized crime, bandits who happened to be nobles. They'd extort money from travelers, raid neighboring territories without official sanction. Essentially use their military power for private profit. This was technically illegal and violated the code of chivalry, but enforcement was spotty, especially in frontier regions or during times of weak central authority. Younger sons faced particularly difficult economics. Inheritance generally went to the eldest son. Younger sons might receive small grants of land if the family was wealthy, or they might receive nothing at all. They had the training and status of knights, but without the income to support that status. These landless knights had several options. They could join a lord's household retinue, serving for wages. They could try to make their fortune in tournaments or war. They could marry into money if they were lucky enough to find a wealthy heiress. They could join religious military orders like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller, which provided for their needs in exchange for vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Or they could sink in status, unable to maintain the expensive equipment and lifestyle required of knights. This was considered shameful, but it happened. Men with knight training worked as mercenaries or men-at-arms, essentially upper-level infantry, because they couldn't afford horses and full armor. Women's economic role was significant, though often overlooked. Noble women brought dowries to their marriages, which could be substantial. They might also bring land as part of the marriage settlement. Widows had dower rights, the right to a portion of their husband's estate for their lifetime. A wealthy widow could be a very attractive marriage prospect for an ambitious knight. Women managed household finances, often with more skill than their husbands. They supervised servants, managed supplies, and handled accounts. When their husbands were away, they managed the entire estate. Some women were quite effective at this and increased their family's wealth through good management. The economics of knighthood helps explain many aspects of medieval history that seem puzzling otherwise. Why were knights so eager to go on crusades? Partly religious devotion, but also the hope of wealth and land in the East. Why were tournaments so popular despite being dangerous? Because the prizes and ransoms could be lucrative, and the reputation gained could lead to better positions. Why did knights betray their lords and switch allegiances? often because they were offered better terms, more land, more money by rivals. The bonds of loyalty were real, but they competed with economic pressures. A knight deeply in debt might be tempted to betray his lord for a rival who offered to pay off those debts. Why did the feudal system eventually break down? Partly because money became more important and the personal bonds of landholding and service became less so. Kings found they could hire mercenary armies with cash rather than relying on the 40-day service of feudal levies. Knights found they could earn more serving for wages than from their fiefs alone. The economics of knighthood was a constant background pressure shaping every decision. You had to calculate constantly. Can I afford to campaign this year? Can I afford a new horse? Can I afford to participate in that tournament? Should I accept that lord's offer of service? Can I afford to marry? And if so, who can I afford to marry? Being a knight meant living with this financial stress constantly. Yes, you were privileged compared to peasants, but you were also trapped in an expensive status that you had to constantly maintain or risk losing everything. Your equipment was worth a fortune, but it was also necessary for your very survival in battle. Your fief was your economic foundation, but it required constant management, and the income could fluctuate with harvests and circumstances. Your reputation was an intangible asset, but it had real economic value in determining what opportunities came your way. It was a precarious existence for many knights, requiring skill not just in warfare, but in financial management, political maneuvering, and strategic marriage alliances. The knights who thrived were those who could balance all of these demands successfully. The age of the knight didn't end suddenly. It was a gradual decline over more than 2 centuries, driven by changes in technology, economics, politics, and society. But by the end of the 16th century, the knight as a dominant military force was essentially finished, though the title and the cultural legacy persisted. The roots of the decline were already visible in the 14th century. The introduction and refinement of the longbow and the crossbow showed that well-trained archers could defeat cavalry. The English demonstrated this repeatedly during the 100 Years' War. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen absolutely devastated French cavalry charges. At Poitiers in 1356 and Agincourt in 1415, the same pattern repeated. French knights, the flower of their nobility, were slaughtered by commoners with bows. This was psychologically devastating to knightly culture. Knights had always seen themselves as the elite, the irreplaceable warriors that armies were built around. The idea that a peasant with a bow, a man with a few years of training, could kill a knight who had trained his entire life and who wore a fortune in armor was almost unbearable. The Swiss demonstrated that well-trained infantry with pikes could not only stop cavalry charges, but could actually defeat knights in offensive action. Swiss pike formations, dense masses of men with long pikes all pointed outward, were like mobile fortresses. Cavalry couldn't break them. The Swiss would advance steadily, and when they made contact with the enemy, the momentum of their advance combined with the weight of their formation was devastating. These tactical developments showed that the cavalry charge, the core of knightly warfare, could be countered by much cheaper troops. A man with a pike or a longbow was far less expensive to equip and train than a knight. The economic logic was becoming clear. Why maintain expensive cavalry when infantry could do the job better for less cost? But the real death blow came from gunpowder. Firearms emerged in Europe in the 14th century, but the early guns were crude, unreliable, and not particularly effective. They were novelties more than serious weapons. But over the next 2 centuries, firearms improved dramatically. Arquebuses and muskets became more reliable, more powerful, more accurate, and they had one crucial advantage over bows or crossbows: they required minimal training. You could train a man to use a musket effectively in a few weeks. Creating a skilled longbowman took years. More devastating was the development of field artillery. Cannons could knock down castle walls that had stood for centuries. The defensive advantages that castles provided, which had made feudal warfare so dominated by sieges, evaporated. A castle that might take months or years to starve into submission could be battered into rubble in days by cannon fire. This eliminated one of the key functions of knights. They were castle garrisons, defenders of fortifications, besiegers of enemy strongholds. If castles couldn't provide security, if they were vulnerable to artillery, then the whole defensive structure of feudalism was undermined. Artillery and muskets also made armor increasingly obsolete. Early firearms couldn't reliably penetrate quality armor, but as they improved, armor that could stop a musket ball became too heavy to wear. Armorers tried for a while, making thicker and thicker armor, but eventually it became clear that it wasn't practical. Armor began to be discarded piece by piece, first the leg armor, then the arm armor, eventually leaving just a breastplate or nothing at all. Without armor, knights lost their primary defensive advantage. Without the advantage of fighting from horseback against infantry, they lost their offensive advantage. What was left? Just men on horses with swords, not fundamentally different from any other cavalry. The political and economic changes were equally important. Feudalism was giving way to more centralized nation-states. Kings were consolidating power, reducing the autonomy of nobles. They were funding their activities through taxation rather than feudal service. They were building professional standing armies that existed year-round, not just for the 40 days of feudal obligation. These professional armies were more effective than feudal levies. They trained together as units. They developed discipline and cohesion. They could campaign for as long as necessary without worrying about service obligations expiring. And they could incorporate the new weapons technologies effectively, forming pike squares and musket lines that were far more effective than collections of individual knights. Knights found themselves increasingly irrelevant militarily. They could serve in these new armies, but they served as cavalry officers, as commanders, not as the dominant tactical force. Their individual martial prowess mattered less than their ability to lead and command disciplined troops. The economic foundations of knighthood were also eroding. The feudal system of land tenure was being replaced by other forms of property ownership and economic organization. The rise of commerce and trade created new sources of wealth that didn't depend on land. A successful merchant might be wealthier than a knight, but have no military obligations or pretensions. Knights who couldn't adapt economically often found themselves impoverished. Their income from land couldn't compete with commercial wealth. Their expensive equipment and lifestyle became increasingly difficult to maintain. Many noble families that had been prominent for generations found themselves in decline. The cultural prestige of knighthood persisted even as its military relevance faded. Being knighted remained an honor. The title of Sir still conveyed status. Chivalric ideals still shaped how nobles saw themselves, but it was increasingly disconnected from military reality. Tournaments continued, but became more and more elaborate and theatrical, more about pageantry than combat. Jousting became a highly stylized sport with rigid rules and specialized equipment, far removed from any practical military application. It was entertainment, a way for nobles to display wealth and culture, not serious military training. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century had an interesting effect on knightly culture. Chivalric romances, stories of King Arthur and other legendary knights could now be mass-produced. Books like Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur spread the mythology of knighthood to a wide audience. But this was mythology, idealized stories that bore little resemblance to the reality of medieval warfare. The printed romances created an image of knighthood that became increasingly dominant even as actual knights were becoming militarily obsolete. By the 17th century, the knight as a military unit was essentially extinct. Cavalry still existed and would continue to exist into the 20th century, but it was professional cavalry, part of organized armies, not individual knights serving feudal obligations. Armor had been largely abandoned. Swords were still carried, but increasingly as symbols of rank rather than primary weapons. Firearms dominated the battlefield. But the cultural legacy persisted and persists to this day. The image of the knight in shining armor, the brave warrior fighting for honor and justice, protecting the weak, serving his lord and his lady, this image is deeply embedded in Western culture. We see it in our language. Chivalry still means courteous behavior, especially toward women. A knight in shining armor is still shorthand for an idealized savior. We still use phrases like knightly virtue or noble deed with meanings shaped by medieval chivalric culture. We see it in our literature and entertainment. Fantasy novels and films are full of knights and chivalric codes. The stories of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail, these are retold again and again in modern forms. Medieval-style fantasy is one of the most popular genres. We see it in our values and ideals. The concept of a code of honor, of loyalty and duty, of protecting those weaker than yourself, of behaving with courtesy and respect, these all have roots in chivalric culture. Yes, medieval knights often failed to live up to these ideals, but the ideals themselves have had lasting influence. We see it in our institutions. The British monarchy still creates knights, though now it's an honor given for achievement rather than a military role. Orders of knighthood like the Order of the Garter or the Order of the British Empire continue to exist as honors. The title Sir is still used and still conveys respect. We see it in how we think about combat and heroism. The image of individual combat between skilled warriors, of personal bravery and martial prowess, of honor in victory and grace in defeat, all of this comes from chivalric tradition. Even in modern military culture, with all its technology and industrial scale, there's still respect for individual courage and skill that echoes knightly values. The reality of being a knight in the medieval age was far more complex, difficult, and morally ambiguous than the legends suggest. It was a life of hard training, crushing expenses, constant warfare, political maneuvering, and moral compromises. Knights were violent men in a violent age, sometimes heroes, sometimes oppressors, usually something in between. But the ideal of knighthood, the aspiration toward honor, courage, loyalty, and skill in service of something greater than oneself, that ideal has proven remarkably durable. It has survived the military obsolescence of actual knights. It has survived the radical transformations of society and culture over the past 500 years. And it continues to shape how we tell stories, how we think about heroism, how we aspire to behave at our best. The age of the knight is over, but the legacy of the knight lives on. And now you know what it was really like, both the glory and the grit, the ideals and the reality, the legend and the life. The next time you see a knight in a movie or read about one in a book, you'll understand the real history behind the armor, the human being inside the legend. And that understanding, that connection to the past, is perhaps the most valuable thing we can gain from studying history. Because at its core, the story of the medieval knight is a human story. It's about people trying to find meaning and purpose in a dangerous world. It's about balancing ideals with reality, aspiration with compromise. It's about the costs of violence and the bonds of loyalty. It's about how societies organize themselves, how they justify their hierarchies, how they pass down their values. The knights themselves would be astonished to know we're still talking about them 700 years later. Most of them probably saw themselves as just doing their jobs, fulfilling their obligations, trying to survive and maybe prosper in the process. They wouldn't have seen themselves as legendary figures. They were just people living their lives according to the rules and expectations of their time. But those lives, those rules, those expectations shape the world we live in today in countless ways. Our legal systems, our concepts of honor and duty, our ideas about courage and heroism, our very language, all of these bear the marks of that medieval warrior culture. Understanding where these things come from helps us understand ourselves, helps us see which of these inherited ideas still serve us, and which might need to be reconsidered. The medieval knight was a product of his time, shaped by forces and circumstances we can barely imagine. The constant threat of violence, the deep religiosity, the rigid social hierarchies, the personal nature of power and authority, all of these created the world in which knights operated. They were shaped by that world, and in turn, they shaped it. Were they heroes? Sometimes. Were they villains? Sometimes. Mostly they were complex human beings doing their best in difficult circumstances, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always struggling with the gap between who they were supposed to be and who they actually were. In that way, they're not so different from us. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those armored figures from so long ago. Imagine the weight of the armor, the smell of the horse, the fear before battle, the exhaustion after. Imagine the pride of being dubbed a knight, the satisfaction of a tournament victory, the grief of losing a friend in combat. Imagine the complex web of obligations and relationships, the constant calculations of honor and profit, the struggle to live up to impossible ideals. These were real people, living real lives. In a world that was brutal, but also bound by codes and traditions that gave it structure and meaning. Their world is gone, but echoes of it remain all around us. And now you've walked through that world, seen it from the inside, understood something of what it meant to be a knight in the medieval age. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, if you found it interesting or educational or just relaxing to listen to, please consider leaving a like on this video. It helps other people find this content and lets me know you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you want to explore more history with me, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, many more worlds to explore, many more fascinating glimpses into how people lived in times and places very different from our own. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring the world of the medieval knight. Sleep well, and perhaps dream of distant battles, ancient castles, and a time when honor and steel ruled the world. Good night.